They thought calling the Alpha King handsome would get her killed. They thought the Omega servant was invisible, forgettable, nothing more than a shadow moving between crystal glasses and polished shoes. But they were wrong. He wasn't sleeping. He was hunting for her. The scene flashes white, then gold. A woman stands in a ballroom of shattered glass, her eyes burning like molten silver. She wears a gown that costs more than kingdoms, and a crown that weighs less than the truth she carries in her chest.
You're coming
Beside
with me.
her, a man built
please.
like war
You have no
itself
choice.
drops to one knee, not in submission, in worship. Mine, he growls, and the word shakes the foundations of the world. The image fractures, rewinds, dissolves into darkness. 72 hours earlier, that same woman was invisible. 72 hours earlier, she was nobody. 72 hours earlier, she made a mistake that would burn down everything she thought she knew about survival. This is how monsters find their mates. This is how the invisible become inevitable. This is how a single whisper can rewrite destiny. The Grand Alpha Summit smelled like power and expensive cologne. Lyra Ashenmere moved through the ballroom like smoke, weightless and unseen. Her servant's uniform hung loose on her frame black fabric against skin that hadn't seen sunlight in months. She was 24 years old and already ancient with exhaustion. The silver tray in her hands held champagne flutes that cost more than her life, and she balanced them with the precision of someone who knew that mistakes meant bruises. Rule number 1, never look an alpha in the eye. Rule number 2, stay invisible. She had learned these rules the hard way, carved into her bones by 18 years of servitude. The Crimson Moon Pack had taken her in when she was 6 years old, orphaned, when her parents were killed as rogues on the border. They called it mercy. She called it survival. There was a difference she had learned between being saved and being owned. The ballroom stretched before her like a cathedral of excess. 300 alphas from every corner of the Northern Territories filled the space, their voices a symphony of dominance and barely concealed aggression. Crystal chandeliers caught the light and threw it across faces that could start wars or end them. These were the predators of the shifter world gathered in one place for a summit that happened only once every 5 years, and Lyra was invisible among them. She wove between bodies that towered over her, each step calculated to avoid touching, to avoid notice. A beta wolf bumped her shoulder without apology. She steadied the tray without spilling a drop. Years of practice had taught her to move like water, to flow around obstacles, to never make waves. More champagne, someone barked. She didn't look up to see who. It didn't matter. They all sounded the same when they spoke to servants. She glided forward, offered the tray, retreated. The pattern was muscle memory now. Survive the night, collect the leftover food from the kitchens after everyone had gone. Sleep in the servants' quarters that smelled like bleach and disappointment. Wake up and do it again. This was her life. This was all her life would ever be. The head housekeeper, a bitter woman named Agnes, appeared at her elbow like a vengeful ghost. The VIP lounge needs clearing, glasses everywhere. Get to it before someone important notices. Lyra nodded, keeping her eyes down. Agnes had a talent for finding reasons to dock pay or assign the worst tasks. The VIP lounge was supposed to be restricted, reserved for the highest-ranking alphas, but it was also supposed to be empty right now. Everyone was meant to be in the ballroom posturing and making deals that would reshape pack politics for the next half-decade. She slipped through the heavy mahogany doors, grateful for the sudden quiet. The VIP lounge was a different world. Where the ballroom was all light and noise, this space was shadow and silence. Aged leather furniture sat in pools of amber lamplight. The scent of cigar smoke hung in the air, mixed with something darker, something that made the hair on her arms stand up. It smelled like a forest just before a storm, like danger. She moved toward the low table, her eyes already cataloging the mess. Crystal tumblers with amber liquid still pooled at the bottom, an ashtray that needed emptying. Evidence of powerful men making powerful decisions. Then she heard it, a breath, deep and rhythmic, the sound of someone sleeping. Lyra froze. Her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light and she saw him. On the Chesterfield sofa in the corner, a man lay sleeping. But not just any man. Even unconscious, even in the half-dark, she knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. Cale Thornwald, the Iron Wolf, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. He was massive even in sleep. His broad shoulders strained against the fabric of his dark suit, the jacket discarded somewhere, his white shirt unbuttoned out at the collar. One large hand rested on his stomach, rising and falling with each breath. The other hand hung off the edge of the sofa, his fingers scarred from countless battles she had only heard about in whispered stories. She should have left immediately. That was the smart thing to do, the only thing to do. But Lyra found herself rooted to the spot, caught in the strange magnetism of seeing the monster at rest. Without the terrifying intensity of his presence, without the golden eyes that could command armies with a single glance, his features were almost peaceful. His dark hair fell over his forehead, softening the brutal lines of his jaw. The scars that marked his skin told stories of survival, of war, of a life lived on the knife's edge of violence. For a moment, he didn't look like the tyrant who crushed rebellions. He looked like a man who carried the weight of kingdoms on his shoulders and never complained about the burden. He looked beautiful. The thought came unbidden, dangerous, utterly foolish. Lyra took a step closer, curiosity overriding every survival instinct that screamed at her to run. The air around him seemed to crackle with some invisible force, making her skin prickle with awareness. In the safety of the silence, thinking he was deep in dreamless slumber, she let the thought that had been sitting on the tip of her tongue slip out into the quiet room. Her voice was barely a whisper, soft as exhaled breath, trembling with the weight of a truth she would never have dared to speak aloud if she thought anyone could hear. It's a shame the devil is so handsome. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, instant, suffocating. Lyra turned to leave, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs, her survival instincts finally catching up to her stupidity. She had spoken in the presence of an alpha king. She had dared to have an opinion about him. A sound stopped her cold, a sharp intake of breath. Time seemed to fragment. She looked back at the sofa, her eyes widening as realization crashed over her like ice water. Cale Thornwild was no longer sleeping. His eyes were wide open, glowing with a predatory light that pierced through the shadows and pinned her to the expensive rug. They weren't just gold. They were molten, burning with an intensity that made her feel like prey, caught in the gaze of something ancient and unstoppable. There was no grogginess in that stare, only a terrifying, razor-sharp focus. He rose from the sofa with a fluid grace that defied his massive size, unfolding his height until he towered over the room. Lyra couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She watched in paralyzed horror as he didn't lunge for her, didn't shout, didn't do any of the things she expected. Instead, he walked, calmly, deliberately, past her. He moved to the mahogany door she had just entered, through his footsteps, silent on the thick carpet despite his size. She heard the brass lock turn with a click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He had locked them in, then he turned slowly to face her. A low rumble started deep in his chest, a sound that was more felt than heard. It vibrated through the floor, through her bones, through the very air between them. Lyra pressed her back against the nearest wall, her pulse hammering in her throat like a trapped bird trying to escape her skin. She opened her mouth to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to explain that she was just a foolish servant who spoke out of turn. But the words died in her throat as he stepped into her personal space. He was massive, a wall of muscle and heat that blocked out the dim light of the lounge, effectively erasing the rest of the world. The scent of him washed over her, cedar and rain, and something wild that had no name. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, terrifying. Cale leaned down, his face inches from hers. Up close, he was even more devastating. His features were sharp as cut glass, all brutal angles, and barely contained violence. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pale against tan skin. His jaw was covered in dark stubble that only made him look more dangerous. He didn't speak. Instead, he inhaled deeply. The sound was ragged, primal. His nostrils flared as he took in the scent of her fear mixed with the natural fragrance of her skin. To Lyra, she smelled like dish soap and cheap laundry detergent and the sweat of a long night's work. But something in his reaction suggested he was smelling something else entirely. She watched, transfixed and terrified, as his pupils dilated. They swallowed the gold of his irises until his eyes were nearly black pools of something she couldn't name. Something hungry, something desperate. His hand came up and she flinched, expecting a blow. But his palm slammed against the wall beside her head, instead trapping her completely. The vibration traveled through her spine, rattling her teeth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low gravel that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Say it again. It wasn't a request. It was a command given by a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Lyra trembled, shaking her head slightly, too terrified to speak. She thought he was mocking her, preparing to punish her for her insolence, for daring to have thoughts about someone so far above her station, for being so stupid as to voice them aloud. But then his other hand came up, and instead of violence, his fingers grazed the sensitive skin of her neck. The touch was electric. A jolt of pure heat shot through her, starting where his fingertips brushed her pulse point and radiating outward until every nerve ending in her body felt like it was on fire. She gasped, the sound small, and shocked her body, arching away from the wall involuntarily. That small sound, that involuntary reaction seemed to snap something in Cale Thornwill. The beast inside him, the ancient wolf that had been cold and dormant for what felt like lifetimes, roared to life with a violence that demanded release. She saw it happen in his eyes, watched as the human restraint shattered and something primal took over. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling sharply, desperately, like a drowning man finally breaking the surface. His breath was hot against her skin, sending shivers down her spine despite the heat radiating from his body. Then he pulled back just enough to look at her. Really, look at her, and his mouth opened. The sound that came out wasn't words, it was a roar that shattered the crystal vase on the side table, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. Mine! The word wasn't spoken, it was torn from his throat, a declaration of ownership that shook the very foundations of the room. It was loud enough to be heard outside, loud enough to stop the music in the ballroom beyond. Almost immediately, the heavy door handle jiggled violently. Fists pounded against the mahogany. "Your Majesty, King Thornwill, is everything all right?" The security team was trying to breach the room, sensing the explosion of alpha power that had just detonated inside. The air itself felt thick with it, pressing down on Lyra's shoulders like a physical weight. But Kyle didn't move away from her. He kept his body pressed against hers, shielding her from the door, from the world, from everything that existed beyond this moment. His eyes locked on her face with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only thing in the universe that mattered. He turned his head slightly toward the door and let out a low, warning growl that vibrated through the wood. It was a sound so lethal, so filled with promised violence, that the pounding stopped instantly. No one dared enter a room where the Iron Wolf was claiming his territory. Kyle looked back at Lyra, his expression fierce and unyielding. His thumb traced her lower lip, the touch gentle despite the barely leashed violence, humming in every line of his body. "You," he said, his voice rough, "are not a servant anymore." His eyes burned into hers, gold and black and infinite. "You are mine." Lyra couldn't process what was happening. Her mind felt like it had been thrown against a wall and left to slide down in slow motion. The Alpha King was touching her, had roared for her, was calling her his. It made no sense. She was nobody. She was invisible. She was the girl who scrubbed floors and ate leftover bread and slept on a cot in a room with 5 other servants who snored. But Kyle Thornwill was looking at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. His hand was still on her face thumb, stroking her cheekbone with a reverence that seemed at odds with the violence still radiating from every other part of him. She could feel his heart pounding against her chest where their bodies were pressed together, could feel the heat of him seeping through the thin fabric of her uniform. "I don't understand," she managed to whisper, her voice shaking. Something flickered in his eyes, not anger, something softer, almost vulnerable. "You will," he said. His other hand came up to cup her face, holding her like she was something precious and breakable. The contrast between his scarred, battle-worn hands and the gentleness of his touch made her throat tight. Then his gaze dropped to her neck, to the spot where her pulse was visible, hammering frantically beneath pale skin. His eyes darkened further, and she felt him lean in, felt his breath ghost across that vulnerable expanse. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something other than stand there and let this happen. But her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen, caught between terror and something else, something that felt dangerously like anticipation. His lips brushed her skin, feather light, and she gasped again. The sound seemed to affect him profoundly. His hands tightened on her face, his body pressing more firmly against hers, pinning her to the wall. "Say it again," he commanded, his voice a low rumble against her neck. "What you said before, say it." Lyra's mind was blank with panic and confusion and the overwhelming sensation of being this close to the most dangerous predator in the known world. She couldn't remember what she had said, couldn't remember her own name. I don't—" "The devil," Cale prompted, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. There was something almost desperate in his expression, now hiding beneath the dominance. "You called me handsome." The memory slammed back into her. Oh no. "I'm sorry," she breathed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't mean I thought you were asleep. I would never." "Say it again," he interrupted, and this time it wasn't a command. It was almost a plea. She stared at him, this mountain of a man who looked like he could tear apart armies with his bare hands, and saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected to find. Loneliness. Bone deep and ancient. The words came out before she could stop them, barely a whisper. "You're handsome." The effect was immediate and profound. Cale's eyes flared bright gold, and a shudder ran through his entire body. He closed his eyes, breathing her in again, and when he opened them, there was something settled in his expression, something decided. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice quiet now intimate. "For 10 years I've been looking for you." "I don't understand what that means." "You will," he said again. Then more gently, "What's your name?" "Lyra." It came out shaky. "Lyra Ashenmere." "Lyra." He said it like a prayer, like a word he had been waiting his whole life to speak. "I'm going to let you go now. I'm going to step back. But you need to understand something first." She nodded, incapable of speech. "What you're feeling right now." Kale continued, his thumb still tracing patterns on her cheek. "This pull between us. It's real. It's not going away. And every instinct in me is screaming to keep you right here against this wall until you understand what you are to me." "What am I?" she whispered. His smile was sharp and possessive and completely terrifying. "Mine," he said simply, "but I'll give you time to figure that out." He stepped back finally, and the loss of his heat was like a physical blow. Lyra sagged against the wall, her legs shaking, her mind reeling. Kale straightened his shirt, ran a hand through his hair, and suddenly looked every inch the Alpha King again. Controlled, dangerous, utterly in command. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good, because we're leaving, and I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes. Can you do that?" "Leaving," Lyra's voice came out small. "I can't leave. I have to work. I have to—" "You don't have to do anything except come with me," Kale interrupted. His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Everything else is handled." "But I can't go out there." She gestured helplessly at the door at the world beyond. "Look at me, I'm nobody. They'll laugh at you, they'll—" "Let them laugh." He said it so simply, with such absolute certainty, that for a moment she almost believed him. Then reality crashed back in. She looked down at herself, at the ill-fitting servant's uniform that hung on her too thin frame, at the scuffed shoes that were 2 sizes too big because they were hand-me-downs from another servant who had left, at her hands red and chapped from years of scrubbing and cleaning. "Please," she whispered, hating how her voice broke. "You don't understand. Out there, there are hundreds of people, important people, and I'm just what?" Kale's voice had gone soft, but there was steel underneath. "Nothing," she finished miserably. The growl that rumbled from his chest made her flinch. He was back in her space before she could blink, one hand tilting her chin up until she had no choice but to meet his eyes. "Never," he said, each word deliberate and heavy with command. "Say that again. Do you understand me?" She trembled, but didn't answer. "You are not nothing, Lyra Ashenmere, and anyone who made you believe that is going to regret it." Before she could respond, he moved. His jacket came off in one smooth motion, expensive fabric that probably cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. He draped it over her shoulders, and the weight of it was substantial real. It smelled like him cedar and rain and that indefinable wildness. The jacket was enormous on her small frame, the silk lining warm from his body heat. It swallowed her, completely falling to her mid-thighs and hiding the servant's uniform from view. Kale buttoned it under her chin with surprisingly dexterous fingers, his face intense with concentration. When he finished, he stepped back to survey his work, and something in his expression softened. "Better," he murmured. Then his voice changed, became harder, colder. The voice of a king. "Let them laugh," he said again, "and I will tear their throats out." He didn't wait for her permission. He didn't ask if she was ready. Kale Thornwell wrapped a possessive arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side, and walked to the door. He unlocked it with one hand, the click of the brass lock seeming impossibly loud. Then he kicked it open. The transition was jarring. The bright lights of the corridor assaulted Lyra's eyes after the dim intimacy of the lounge. The sudden wave of noise, conversations, music, the clink of glasses was overwhelming after the silence they had shared. But none of it compared to what happened next. They stepped into the grand ballroom, and every head turned. Every single one. 300 of the most powerful shifters in the Northern Territories stopped mid-sentence, mid-drink, mid-breath. The orchestra stumbled to a halt, the last violin note hanging in the air like a question. The silence was suffocating. Lyra kept her eyes on the floor, focusing on the movement of Kale's polished shoes, trying to breathe through the waves of shock and confusion and barely concealed hostility rolling off the crowd. She was an anomaly, a glitch in their perfect, ordered world, a servant girl wrapped in the Alpha King's jacket. The contrast was stark and shocking. Kale walked with his head high, his posture radiating absolute dominance. His presence commanded the enormous space as naturally as breathing. He was power incarnate, dressed in a custom suit that probably cost more than a house, his every movement speaking of violence barely leashed. And beside him, drowning in his jacket, was Lyra. Too thin, too pale, too obviously not one of them. She could feel their stares like physical blows, could sense the calculations happening behind elegant masks, the judgment, the disgust, the envy. They were all wondering the same thing. What was the Iron Wolf doing with trash? But Kael did not rush. He did not hurry or slink or show even a hint of shame. He paraded her through the center of the room, cutting a path through the dignitaries like a ship moving through water. His arm never loosened from her waist. His stride never faltered. When a high-ranking alpha from the Southern Territories stepped forward, perhaps to ask a question or offer a greeting, Kael let out a low, rumbling snarl that stopped the man in his tracks. The sound was a warning, a threat, a promise. Do not approach. Do not look. Do not breathe in her direction. The alpha stumbled back, his face going pale. Around them, the crowd parted further, creating a wide berth. No one dared get close. Lyra felt the vibration of Kael's growl through his chest where their bodies pressed together. It was a terrifying sound, raw and animalistic, and completely at odds with the civilized setting. But it was also, in some strange way, comforting, because it wasn't directed at her. For the first time in her life, the monster was on her side. Near the entrance to the ballroom, she caught sight of Agnes, the head housekeeper. The woman's face was a mask of shock and fury. Beside her, other servants whispered frantically, their eyes wide with disbelief. Lyra wanted to disappear, wanted to sink into the floor and never be seen again. Instead, Kael kept walking, kept claiming space, kept making it clear to everyone watching that she was under his protection. They reached the grand exit, and Lyra felt cool night air hit her face. The November chill should have been uncomfortable, but the heat radiating from Kael's body kept her warm. His arm around her waist never wavered, never loosened. He guided her down marble steps toward a waiting convoy of black vehicles, sleek, expensive armored, the kind of transportation that screamed power and money and danger. A man stood beside the lead vehicle, dressed in dark tactical gear. He was tall, though not as tall as Kael, with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. When he saw them approaching, saw Lyra in Kael's jacket, his eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "we weren't expecting—" "Draven," Kael's voice was clipped. "Open the door." The man Draven hesitated for only a fraction of a second before moving to comply. He pulled open the back door of the limousine, his expression carefully neutral, though Lyra caught the flash of curiosity in his eyes. Kael guided her into the vehicle, first his hand on the small of her back, protective and possessive. The interior was all black leather and tinted windows, insulated from the world outside. He climbed in after her, and the door closed with a soft, final sound. For a moment, they sat in silence. Lyra pressed herself into the corner of the seat, as far from Kael as the limited space allowed. Her mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened, what was still happening. She had just walked through the Grand Alpha Summit in the Iron Wolf's jacket, had been paraded in front of the most powerful shifters in the territories like what? A prize, a possession, a mate. The thought made her head spin. Kael was watching her from the other side of the limousine, his golden eyes catching the faint light from the tinted windows. His expression was intense, calculating, but there was something else there too, something almost uncertain. "You have to let me go," Lyra said, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to look at him, forced herself to be brave for just a few more seconds. "You don't know who I am. I have no bloodline. My parents were rogues, killed at the border when I was 6. I have no wolf spirit to speak of. I can't even shift properly. I am the lowest rank there is." She spilled the secrets she usually guarded with her life, desperate to make him see reason before it was too late, before whatever mistake he was making became irreversible. "You are a king. You need a Luna who is strong, someone with power, someone from a good family, someone who can stand beside you without making you look weak." Her voice broke on the last word. "If you take me," she continued, hating the tears that were building behind her eyes, "you will be weak. They will use me against you. They will question your judgment. They will—" Kael moved before she could blink. One moment he was on the other side of the limousine. The next he was looming over her, crowding her into the corner of the leather seat. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming, filling every inch of space until there was nothing but him. "Weak," he repeated, and the word came out like a curse. His eyes burned into hers gold fire in the darkness. "You think I am so fragile that a mate of lower status will crumble my kingdom? You think my throne rests on something as meaningless as bloodline politics?" He leaned closer, and Lyra pressed back into the seat, her heart hammering. You insult me, little one. The endearment should have sounded condescending. Instead, it sounded almost affectionate, possessive in a way that made heat pool in her stomach. Kale reached out his movements, slow and deliberate, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't move, his fingers tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch lingered on her cheek, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. I do not need a political alliance, he said, his voice dropping to something quieter, more intimate. I have armies for that. I do not need a warrior to fight beside me. I have killers for that. I do not need any of the things you think I need. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, and the tenderness of the gesture made her breath catch. I need you, Lyra Ashenmere. Not because of what you can give me, not because of what you can do for my kingdom. I need you because you are mine, and I am yours. That's all that matters. Lyra stared at him, stunned into silence by the conviction in his voice. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, to make him understand the danger he was putting himself in. But the words wouldn't come, because some part of her, some deep instinctual part that she had learned to ignore years ago, believed him. Kale seemed to sense her internal struggle. His expression softened fractionally, and he pulled back just enough to give her space to breathe. No more, he said firmly. You doubt yourself because the world has told you that you are nothing. I will spend the rest of my life showing you that they were wrong. He reached for the intercom system built into the armrest and pressed a button. The speaker crackled to life. Draven, he said, his eyes never leaving Lyra's face. Prepare the jet. We leave for the Iron Kingdom tonight. A pause, then Draven's voice, carefully controlled, understood Alpha. I'll notify the palace. Kale pressed another button and the intercom went silent. The car began to move, pulling away from the summit venue, away from everything Lyra had ever known. She watched through the tinted window as the grand building grew smaller, as the lights faded into the distance. The finality of it terrified her. The Iron Kingdom was thousands of miles away in the frozen north, a brutal territory ruled by a brutal man. She was being swept away by a force she couldn't control, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. But as she glanced at Kyle, at the way his hand still rested on her knee, protective and warm, she realized that part of her didn't want to run. The deep instinctual part of her that had been silent for so long was waking up, and it was whispering a truth that terrified her more than anything else. This felt right. The private airfield was windswept and cold the November night, cutting through Lyra's thin servant uniform, despite Kale's jacket. The jet waiting on the tarmac was sleek and predatory, all dark metal and expensive engineering. A line of guards stood at attention, creating a corridor toward the stairs. Lyra shivered as Kale guided her out of the limousine, his hand firm on the small of her back. She kept her head down, hoping to board quickly and hide from the judgment of the crew and guards, who would undoubtedly wonder what the Alphaking was doing with someone like her. But before they could reach the stairs, a voice cut through the night air. Cassius, surely this is a joke. Lyra's head snapped up. A woman was stepping out from the shadows near the hangar, her movements fluid and graceful. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with cascading silver blonde hair that caught the lights from the runway. Her red dress hugged curves that Lyra would never have, and her blue eyes were sharp with intelligence and barely concealed fury. Even from a distance, Lyra could feel the power radiating from her. This was no servant. This was an alpha in her own right. Kale went rigid beside her. Lyra felt the rumble start deep in his chest, a warning growl that vibrated through the hands still pressed against her back. The woman walked closer, her eyes scanning Lyra from head to toe with the kind of clinical assessment usually reserved for livestock at market. Her perfect lips curved into a smile that had nothing to do with humor. You can't be serious, the woman said, addressing Kale but staring at Lyra. You're dragging a servant onto the royal jet. What is she, a pet? A bedwarmer for the flight? The words hit like physical blows. Lyra felt her face burn with humiliation, felt the familiar shame trying to pull her down into the dirt where she belonged. She tried to step away from Kyle, tried to give him space to deal with this obviously important woman without the embarrassment of her presence. But his grip on her waist tightened almost painfully, keeping her exactly where she was. Really, Drogo, the woman continued, using what was apparently Kyle's given name, with the familiarity of someone who believed she had the right. I know you have appetites, but this is beneath even you. She wrinkled her perfect nose, making a show of waving her hand in front of her face. She smells like floor cleaner and desperation. Send the little rat back to the kitchens where she belongs, and we can discuss the treaty properly. The treaty. The words clicked into place. This woman was political, important, someone Kale needed to maintain alliances, and Lyra was in the way. She pulled harder against Kale's grip, trying to extract herself from a situation that was rapidly becoming unbearable. But he held her like iron, his body a wall of immovable force at her side. He still hadn't looked at the blonde woman. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above her head, his expression carved from stone. Draven, Kale said, his voice deadly calm. The kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. The beta appeared at his shoulder, his face carefully blank. Remove this obstacle from my path. The blonde woman gasped, her perfectly composed mask cracking. You can't dismiss me like this. I am Seraphine Silvercrest. I am a High Alpha's daughter. My father. Your father, Kale interrupted, finally deigning to look at her, will receive formal notification that the Southern Alliance is terminated, effective immediately. Seraphine's face flushed red, her hands clenching into fists. You're choosing trash over me, over a strategic alliance that is held for 50 years over. Kale stopped walking. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every guard on the tarmac went still, and their hands moving instinctively toward weapons they wouldn't dare draw. Slowly, with the kind of deliberate movement that screamed danger, Kale turned his head to look Seraphine Silvercrest directly in the eye. Careful, he whispered. Despite the wind, his voice carried effortlessly. It was the kind of quiet that demanded absolute attention, the kind that made people hold their breath and pray they weren't the target. You are speaking to your future queen. Seraphine's eyes went wide. Kale stepped toward her, and even though he didn't touch her, she stumbled backward. The full weight of his alpha power rolled off him in waves, pressing down on everyone present with the force of inevitability. The only reason you are still breathing, he continued, his voice still that terrible whisper, is because I do not wish to upset her with the sight of blood on our first night together. He moved closer, towering over the woman who had seemed so imposing just moments ago. Now she looked small, fragile, terrified. She is not trash. She is the Luna of the Iron Kingdom. And if you ever, he leaned down, his face inches from hers, ever disrespect her again, I will forget about treaties and diplomacy and the thin veneer of civilization I wear for occasions like this. I will wipe your father's pack off the map. I will salt the earth where your territory stands. I will make sure that the name Silvercrest becomes a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to frighten their children into obedience. The silence that followed was absolute. Seraphine stood frozen, her face drained of all color, trembling like a leaf in a storm. Kale didn't wait for a response. He swept Lyra up into his arms, cradling her bridal style against his chest, and walked past the stunned woman as if she were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Lyra buried her face in his neck, overwhelmed by his defense of her, by the way he had destroyed a political alliance without hesitation, by the casual promise of violence he had made on her behalf. She should have been horrified, should have been afraid. Instead, she felt something warm and fierce unfurling in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. Kale carried her up the stairs of the jet, his arms steady and sure, leaving the old world and its judgments behind on the cold tarmac. As the cabin door hissed shut, sealing them in climate-controlled luxury, Lyra realized there truly was no going back. The war had begun. And somehow, impossibly, she was right in the center of it. The cabin of the private jet was a masterclass in restrained luxury. Cream leather seats that looked more like armchairs than airplane seating, polished walnut accents that gleamed under recessed lighting, windows that could be dimmed with the touch of a button, blocking out the night sky as they climbed to cruising altitude. For Lyra, who had never been on a plane before, who had never been more than 50 miles from the packed territory where she was raised, it felt like stepping into another world entirely. Kale set her down gently in one of the captain's chairs, his movements careful as if he were handling something precious. Then he moved to the seat across from her, giving her space but keeping her within arm's reach. He had removed his tie and unbuttoned the collar of his dress shirt, revealing the thick column of his throat and the faint edge of what looked like a tribal tattoo, disappearing beneath the fabric. He held a glass of amber whiskey in one large hand, swirling the liquid slowly, but he didn't drink. He just watched her. His golden eyes traced every breath she took, every nervous flutter of her hands, every time she glanced toward the windows as the ground fell away beneath them. The silence stretched heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of everything that had happened in the past hour. Lyra felt like an intruder in this world of wealth and power. She was still wearing her servant's uniform. Under his jacket, still felt the ghost of Agnes's disapproving glare, still heard Seraphine's words echoing in her mind. Floor cleaner in desperation. Her stomach gave a treacherous, loud rumble that shattered the quiet. Lyra flushed crimson, mortified, pressing a hand against her midsection. She had learned long ago to ignore hunger, to push through the discomfort until it became background noise. But her body had betrayed her at the worst possible moment. Kale's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it softened the harsh lines of his face in a way that made him look almost human. He didn't mock her, didn't make her feel small for being hungry. Instead, he reached out and pressed a call button built into the armrest. A flight attendant appeared almost instantly from the galley, a young woman in a crisp uniform whose eyes darted nervously toward Kale before settling firmly on the floor. Food, Kale commanded, his voice leaving no room for discussion. Meat rare, and bring everything else you have. The attendant nodded quickly and disappeared. Minutes later, the small table between them was laden with more food than Lyra had seen in months. Platters of fresh fruit, strawberries and grapes, and sliced mango. Artisanal cheeses that probably cost more than her monthly wages. Warm bread that filled the cabin with the scent of yeast and butter. And in the center, a massive steak that was seared on the outside and still bloody in the middle. The smell was intoxicating, rich and primal and overwhelming. Lyra's mouth watered despite her nervousness. Her wolf, the weak, dormant thing she barely felt most days, stirred within her, whining at the scent of protein. She reached for a fork, her hand trembling slightly. But Kyle moved faster. He took the plate with the steak, cut a large, succulent piece, and held it out to her. On the fork, offering it directly. Lyra froze, her eyes going wide. He wasn't going to let her feed herself. This was something else, something primal and possessive. The alpha providing for his mate, ensuring she accepted his sustenance. It was a display of dominance, yes, but also care. Protection. If she ate from his hand, she would be accepting more than just food. She would be acknowledging the bond between them, however confusing and terrifying it might be. Lyra hesitated, her heart pounding. This was a choice. Maybe the first real choice she had been given all night. She could refuse, could insist on feeding herself, could maintain the distance between them and whatever this was becoming. But she looked into Kyle's eyes and saw the raw need burning there. He needed her to accept this, needed her to trust him even just a little. Slowly, carefully, she leaned forward and took the bite. The flavor exploded on her tongue, rich and savory and perfect. She had never tasted anything so good in her entire life. Kale let out a low, satisfied rumble that vibrated through his chest. His eyes darkened with pleasure as he watched her chew, watched her swallow. Then he cut another piece, and another. He fed her slowly, methodically, his complete attention focused on making sure she ate her fill. When she reached for the fruit, he picked up the strawberries himself, holding them to her lips one at a time. It should have felt demeaning, should have made her feel like a pet or a child. Instead, it felt intimate, sacred almost. No one had ever cared whether she ate. No one had ever made sure she had enough. In the servant quarters, it was everyone for themselves, grabbing whatever scraps remained after the pack had finished. But here, 30,000 feet above the ground, the most powerful alpha in the territories was hand-feeding her like she was the most important thing in his world. Only after she was full, almost uncomfortably so, did Kale finally eat something himself. A few bites of steak consumed more out of necessity than desire. As the adrenaline of the evening began to fade, exhaustion crept in. Lyra felt her eyelids growing heavy, her body finally registering how little sleep she had gotten over the past few days. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Your Majesty, we'll be beginning our descent into the Iron Kingdom shortly. Current ground temperature is negative 15 degrees. Winds are gusting at 40 miles per hour." Lyra's blood went cold. Negative 15. She had never experienced anything close to that. The territories where she had grown up were temperate, mild, even in winter. Kale noticed her reaction immediately. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression serious. "The Iron Kingdom is not like the South," he said quietly. "It's harsh, unforgiving. The cold doesn't care about your bloodline or your rank. It will kill you if you're not careful." He reached out his hand, covering both of hers where they were clenched in her lap. "But I will keep you safe, Lyra. I promise you that. No matter what happens when we land, no matter what you face, I will protect you." The conviction in his voice made her believe him. The plane began its descent, and Lyra looked out the window. Below them, the world was white and jagged, mountain peaks covered in snow, forests that looked black against the ice. A landscape that seemed hostile to life itself. This was the Iron Kingdom. This was where the Iron Wolf ruled. This was her new home. Terror and anticipation warred in her chest as the wheels touched down on the frozen runway. The door opened and Arctic air blasted into the cabin. Kale stood, then reached for her, pulling her to her feet. Before she could take a step toward the door, he swept her up into his arms again. "The North does not forgive weakness," he murmured against her hair. "Burrow deep, little one. Let me shield you from the cold." And as he carried her down the stairs, toward a waiting convoy of vehicles, toward a crowd of hundreds gathered to see their king return, Lyra pressed her face into his neck and held on. She was about to meet the Iron Kingdom, and the Iron Kingdom was about to meet her. The convoy moved through streets lined with pack members who had braved the freezing night to witness their king's return. Lyra watched through tinted windows as the Iron Kingdom revealed itself, a fortress city carved from black stone and determination, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Faces pressed close to the glass, trying to catch a glimpse of what the Iron Wolf had brought home. She saw confusion ripple through the crowd, disappointment, anger. They had expected a warrior queen, someone fierce and powerful. Instead, they saw a girl in an oversized jacket trembling despite the warmth inside the vehicle. The palace loomed ahead, jutting from the mountainside like a scar on the landscape. It was massive, intimidating, a structure built to withstand sieges and centuries of northern storms. Kale's hand never left hers during the ride. His thumb traced circles on her palm, silent and protective, claiming her with every touch. When they finally stopped at the palace entrance, he carried her inside past bowing servants and watchful guards. She caught glimpses of their faces, some curious, some openly hostile, all judging whether she was worthy of standing beside their king. They climbed endless stairs to a suite that felt more like a cathedral than a bedroom. Stone walls, soaring ceilings, a fireplace that could swallow her whole. Kale set her down gently near the fire. "Rest," he commanded, but his voice was soft. "Tomorrow the real work begins." He kissed her forehead, the touch lingering, and she felt something shift between them. Not just possession, something deeper. Then he left, locking the door behind him. Alone in the massive room, Lyra finally let herself feel the weight of what had happened. The whisper that had changed everything. The roar that had claimed her. The parade through a ballroom of predators who would tear her apart if given the chance. She was in the Iron Kingdom now, and there was no going back. Morning in the Iron Kingdom came late and reluctant, filtered through heavy velvet curtains that blocked out most of the pale winter sun. Lyra woke slowly, her body sinking into mattress so soft it felt like floating on clouds. For a disoriented moment, she forgot where she was, forgot everything that had happened. Then memory crashed back in waves. The whisper, the lock, the roar. Kale Thornwell claiming her as his, in front of the most powerful shifters in the territories. The flight through darkness to a frozen kingdom at the edge of the world. She sat up abruptly, her heart racing. The bed was enormous, easily large enough to sleep 5 people comfortably. The sheets were silk cool against her skin, and they smelled of sandalwood and something distinctly masculine. Something that made her wolf stir with interest, despite her conscious mind's protests. Kale's scent. But he wasn't here. The space beside her was cold, the pillow undisturbed. He hadn't slept in this bed last night. Or if he had been careful not to touch her, careful to maintain distance. The realization brought an unexpected pang of something that felt uncomfortably like disappointment. Lyra climbed out of bed, her bare feet sinking into carpet so plush it felt sinful. The room around her was a study in dark elegance. Stone walls hung with tapestries depicting wolves in various stages of hunt and triumph. A fireplace large enough to stand in currently crackling with logs the size of small trees. Windows that stretched from floor to ceiling offering a view of mountains so sharp and white they looked like teeth trying to bite the sky. This wasn't just a bedroom. This was a statement of power. She found her servant's uniform folded neatly on a chair, cleaned and pressed. But beside it was something else. A wardrobe built into the wall, its doors standing open to reveal an array of clothing that made her breath catch. Someone had stocked it overnight. Gowns in silk and velvet and cashmere. Colors ranging from deep burgundy to soft cream to midnight black. Heavy fur coats that looked like they could serve in an Arctic expedition. Delicate lingerie that made her face burn just looking at it. It was a costume closet fit for a queen. Not clothes for someone who was used to living in hand-me-downs and uniforms that never quite fit. Lyra reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched a dress of dove-gray wool. The fabric was impossibly soft, clearly expensive, and completely impractical for someone like her. These were clothes meant for formal dinners and political meetings and events she had no business attending. She selected the simplest thing she could find, a long-sleeve dress in charcoal that was still far too elegant for her comfort, and dressed quickly. The fabric settled against her skin like a whisper, and when she caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked almost refined, almost like she belonged here. Almost, but her eyes gave her away. Wide and uncertain, rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that came from a lifetime of fear. Lyra approached the double doors that led out of the suite, her stomach growling with hunger. She had eaten on the plane, but that felt like a lifetime ago, and her body was used to scavenging whatever scraps it could find. She tried the handle. It turned and relief flooded through her. She wasn't locked in. She could... The door opened to reveal two massive guards standing on either side of the entrance, their arms crossed over barrel chests. They were dressed in black tactical gear, weapons visible on their belts, and they looked at her with the kind of neutral assessment that made her feel like an insect under glass. Lara took a step back instinctively. "I need to go to the kitchen," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Her voice came out small and shaky, betraying her nervousness. The guard on the left, a man with a scar running down his cheek, didn't move. "The king has ordered you to remain in the suite, Luna." Luna, the title felt wrong in her mouth, like wearing someone else's skin. "I'm hungry," she insisted, taking another step forward. "I just want to get something to eat. I can find the kitchen myself. I won't be any trouble." "We can send for a tray," the guard replied, his tone not unkind but absolutely firm. His Majesty was very clear about your safety. Safety, as if she were in danger from her own hunger. Frustration bubbled up in her chest, hot and unexpected. She had spent her entire life being invisible, moving through spaces without permission, existing in the gaps between other people's attention. And now she was being told to stay put, to wait, to be a good little prisoner in a gilded cage. "I don't want a tray," she said, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. "I want to walk. I want to move. I'm not some porcelain doll that needs to be locked away." She tried to push past them, knowing it was futile but unable to stop herself. The need to do something, to have some control over her own existence, was overwhelming. The guards didn't budge. They were boulders, unmovable and indifferent to her struggle. "Is there a problem?" The voice came from down the hallway, deep and resonant and instantly recognizable. Kale. He was striding toward them, flanked by Draven. He looked exhausted, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept at all. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal the thick muscles of his forearms, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of hours spent dealing with things he couldn't punch into submission. But when his eyes landed on Lyra, something in his expression softened. The guards snapped to attention, immediately stepping back from the doorway. Kale looked from the guards to Lyra's flushed, angry face, taking in the situation with the kind of quick assessment that came from years of leadership. "They won't let me leave," Lyra said before she could stop herself. The words came out, sharp, accusatory. "You locked me in a tower like some damsel in distress." Behind Kale, Draven made a choking sound that might have been a suppressed cough. Clearly, no one spoke to the Iron Wolf like this. But Kyle didn't look angry. He looked at her defiant stance, at the fire in her eyes that had replaced yesterday's fear, and something that looked dangerously like pride flickered across his face. "I'm bored, Kale," she continued, emboldened by his lack of immediate violence. "And I'm hungry. And I hate these clothes. They're too nice, too expensive, too much like you belong here," Kale interrupted quietly. The question hit like a physical blow. Lyra's mouth snapped shut. Kale dismissed the guards with a flick of his wrist. They melted away instantly, disappearing down the corridor with the kind of speed that suggested they were grateful to escape the tension. When they were alone, or as alone as they could be with Draven, standing a respectful distance away, Kale stepped closer. "My apologies, little one," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "I forget that wild things do not like cages, even comfortable ones." He offered her his arm, the gesture formal and courtly, and completely at odds with the predator lurking just beneath his skin. "Come, if you want the kitchen, I will take you to the kitchen myself. But be warned, the chef is terrifying, and he doesn't take kindly to people invading his domain." Despite everything, Lyra felt her lips twitch with the ghost of a smile. She took his arm, and together they walked through corridors of stone and shadow towards something that felt almost normal. The kitchen adventure had been brief and chaotic, involving a chef who had indeed been terrifying and had nearly fainted when Lyra tried to wash her own apple. But it was nothing compared to the ordeal that came that evening. Kale had insisted on a formal dinner to introduce her properly to the inner circle of his court. Now seated at a dining table long enough to land a small aircraft on, Lyra stared down at a plate of food she couldn't identify and felt her throat close up with anxiety. The great hall was enormous, all stone and soaring ceilings, and shadows that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. Servants stood along the walls like statues, their faces carefully blank. But Lyra could feel their stares, their judgment, their whispered speculation about who she was and what she was doing here. At the head of the table, impossibly far away, sat Kyle. He was dressed in a fresh black suit, every inch the Alphaking, his posture radiating the kind of casual authority that came from a lifetime of being obeyed without question. He was cutting his meat with surgical precision, seemingly unbothered by the oppressive atmosphere. Between them sat the members of his council, 6 men and 2 women, all older, all radiating their own considerable power. They watched her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. The eldest among them, a man with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint, had introduced himself as Elder Matthias Ironbane. He had looked at Lyra as if she were a particularly disappointing puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The food on her plate looked like escargot, or perhaps some rare northern delicacy that smelled distinctly like old socks. Lyra poked at it with a silver fork that weighed more than her hand, trying to work up the courage to take a bite. She was starving. Her stomach had been growling for the past hour. But the thought of eating this slimy, unidentifiable thing in front of all these people who were watching her every move made her want to disappear into the floor. "Is the food not to your liking?" Kael's voice echoed down the length of the table, startling her. He had stopped eating and was watching her with that intense analytical gaze that seemed to see straight through every defense she tried to construct. Every head turned toward her. The weight of their collective attention was suffocating. "It's lovely," Lyra lied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just not very hungry." The silence that followed was broken by the sharp sound of metal hitting china. Kael had slammed his knife down on the table. The impact echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Servants flinched. Several council members straightened in their chairs, suddenly alert. "Do not lie to me, Lyra." His voice was quiet, but it carried easily across the space between them. There was steel underneath the words, a command that brooked no disobedience. He stood grabbing his wineglass and walked down the length of the table until he reached her chair. He pulled out the seat next to hers and sat down, invading her space with the kind of casual dominance that made it clear this was his domain and he would sit wherever he damn well pleased. This close she could smell him, cedar and rain, and that wild, indefinable scent that made her wolf whine with longing. "Talk to me," Kael said, his voice dropping to something more intimate. "What do you want?" Lyra looked at him, at the frustration etched in his brow, at the way his jaw was tight with tension, and realized that he was trying. In his own aggressive, over-the-top way, he was trying to make her comfortable, trying to give her what she needed. The realization gave her courage. She pushed the plate of mystery meat away. "I want a cheeseburger," she blurted out. Every council member went still. Elder Matthias's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Lyra felt her face burn, but she forced herself to continue. "A greasy one with pickles and fries. And I want to eat it with my hands. And I want to take off these shoes because they're pinching my toes and I hate them." For a long moment, Kael just stared at her. His expression was completely unreadable. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a deep, rusty sound, as if he hadn't used it in years. The laugh transformed his entire face, erasing the hard lines of command and making him look younger, less like a living weapon and more like a man who had forgotten how to find joy in simple things. He turned to the head steward, who was trembling in the corner like a leaf in a storm. "You heard the Luna?" Kael barked, a grin still lingering on his lips. "Clear this garbage. Bring us burgers and fries, lots of them. And tell the chef if he has a problem with it, he can take it up with me directly." The steward bowed so low he nearly hit his forehead on his knees, then scurried away. The council members looked at each other, uncertain whether this was some kind of test or if the Iron Wolf had truly lost his mind. Kael didn't seem to care about their opinions. He reached under the table and found Lyra's foot, helping her slip off the tortuous heels. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he set them aside. 20 minutes later, the formal dining room witnessed something unprecedented. The great table was laden with platters of burgers, gloriously messy, dripping with cheese and grease, and mountains of golden fries. The crystal wine glasses had been replaced with simple water tumblers. The pristine white tablecloth now had ketchup stains, and the Iron Wolf and his claimed mate sat side by side, eating with their hands like commoners. Lyra had never tasted anything so good. The burger was perfection: juicy meat, crisp lettuce, tangy pickles, all held together by a sesame seed bun that was slightly toasted. She ate with abandon, dipping fries into ketchup and not caring about the grease on her fingers. Kael watched her with something that looked like satisfaction. He ate his own burger with the same savage efficiency he brought to everything else, but there was a relaxation in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. When she had a smudge of ketchup on her chin, he reached out with his thumb and wiped it away. The touch lingered, his skin warm against hers, and Lyra found herself frozen in place, caught in the intensity of his gaze. "Better?" he asked softly. "Much better," she admitted, and the smile that broke across her face was genuine. "Good," Kael murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips. "Because I need you strong, Lyra. Tomorrow I show you what it means to be part of this pack." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. and it will not be as gentle as a dinner date. The promise hung in the air between them, heavy and thrilling. Around them, the council members were trying very hard to pretend they weren't watching, weren't absorbing every detail of this strange courtship happening before their eyes. But Lyra barely noticed them. For the first time since arriving in this frozen kingdom, she felt something other than fear. She felt seen. She felt cared for. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. The sound of metal clashing against metal woke Lyra before dawn had fully broken over the mountains. She rolled over in the massive bed, still alone, still cold on one side where Kael had never slept, and listened to the rhythmic violence echoing from somewhere below. The sound was primal, visceral, the kind of combat that spoke of real danger and real skill. Curiosity overrode caution. She slipped out of bed, grabbing a heavy silk robe to wrap around herself, and followed the sound to a large balcony that overlooked the rear courtyard of the palace. The cold morning air hit her face like a slap, but she barely noticed. Her attention was completely captured by the scene below. The courtyard was a pit of black sand surrounded by high stone walls. Inside the ring, a dozen warriors were sparring, their movements blurring with speed and precision. They were good, better than good. Each one moved with the kind of lethal grace that came from years of training. But in the center of them all was Kael. He was shirtless despite the freezing temperature, his skin glistening with sweat that steamed in the cold air. His back was a canvas of scars, claw marks. Burned scars, old wounds from battles he had survived when others hadn't. Each one told a story of violence and victory. He was fighting 3 men at once, and he was winning. Lyra gripped the stone railing of the balcony, her breath hitching as she watched him move. He dodged a sword swing with inches to spare, grabbed the attacker by the throat, and tossed him into the sand like a rag doll. In the same fluid motion, he spun to block a kick from another warrior, his forearm connecting with the man's shin with a crack that made Lyra wince. He was magnificent. Brutal, yes. Violent, absolutely. But there was something almost artistic about the way he fought. Every movement had purpose. Every strike was calculated. He wasn't fighting out of rage or cruelty. He was fighting because this was what he did. This was how he kept his pack safe. He was the wall that kept the world out. Lyra had always been taught that violence was bad, that alphas were nothing more than bullies who used their strength to dominate the weak. But watching Kael, she realized that his violence was different. It was controlled, precise. He fought so his pack didn't have to. He bore the weight of protection so others could sleep safely in their beds. A strange heat pooled in her belly, a primal reaction to seeing her mate in his element. She had spent her life being afraid of strength, but for the first time she found herself attracted to it. Not because she wanted to be dominated, but because she understood what it meant to have someone strong enough to stand between her and the world. As if sensing her gaze, Kael stopped mid-punch. He froze, his chest heaving with exertion, and slowly turned his head toward the balcony. His eyes locked onto hers instantly, gold burning through the gray morning mist with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He said something to the warriors, who immediately backed away and bowed. Then Kael walked toward the wall below her balcony, grabbing a towel to wipe the sweat from his face. But he never broke eye contact. "Enjoying the show," he called up, his voice rough from exertion. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to look away. "Is that how you solve all your problems, by hitting them?" "Only the stubborn ones," Kael replied, and there was something almost playful in his tone. "Come down here." It wasn't a request. Lyra hesitated only for a moment before turning and running back through the suite, down the stairs, and out the heavy back doors. When she reached the edge of the training ring, the warriors had cleared out, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Kael stood on the other side of a waist-high fence, radiating heat and power, and the kind of raw masculinity that should have terrified her. Sweat dripped down his chest, following the carved lines of muscle that spoke of a life spent preparing for war. He walked over to where she stood, and the smell of him hit her in waves. Musk and sweat and pine, in overwhelming her senses in the best possible way. He didn't open the gate. Instead, he leaned over the fence, trapping her between his arms on the railing. "You should not be out here without a coat," he scolded, though his eyes were devouring the exposed skin of her collarbone where the robe had slipped. "I was watching you," Lyra admitted, breathless. "And what did you see?" Kael asked, leaning closer until his nose brushed against hers. The question felt loaded with meaning. He wasn't asking about the fighting, he was asking something deeper. "I saw a beast," she whispered. "Good," Kael growled. He closed the distance and pressed a hard, demanding kiss to her lips. It tasted of salt and fire and possession. His mouth moved against hers with the same controlled violence he brought to combat, claiming her, marking her, making it absolutely clear that she belonged to him. When he pulled back, Lyra was dizzy, her lips tingling, her heart racing. The wolves are circling Lyra, Kale said, his voice low and serious. He looked over her shoulder toward the palace gates, and you need a beast to keep them away. She followed his gaze and felt her blood run cold. A black sedan was pulling into the driveway, flying a flag she recognized from the airport. The Southern Pack. Seraphine Silvercrest had arrived. The training was over. The real fight was about to begin. Lyra returned to the master suite with her lips still burning from Kale's kiss, her mind spinning with the implications of Seraphine's arrival. The Southern delegation was here probably to salvage the political alliance that Kale had destroyed on the tarmac. She needed to think, needed to process what was happening to her life, how quickly everything was changing. But when she opened the wardrobe to change out of her robe, she froze. Everything was destroyed. The beautiful silk gowns had been slashed, the fabric hanging in ribbons. The wool dresses were ripped at the seams. Even the heavy fur coats had been torn apart, their insides spilling out like guts from a slaughtered animal. Everything Kale had provided for her, everything that had made her feel even remotely like she might belong here, had been methodically, viciously ruined. On some of the garments there were stains that smelled foul and acidic. Someone had poured something caustic on them, ensuring they could never be repaired. It was a message carved into velvet and lace. You do not belong here. Lyra stood frozen, staring at the destruction, feeling the familiar shame trying to crawl back into her chest. This was what she deserved, wasn't it? This was the universe reminding her of her place. But then anger sparked. She was tired of being the victim. Tired of being the invisible servant girl who accepted whatever cruelty the world decided to throw at her. She had been claimed by an Alpha King. She had traveled thousands of miles to a frozen kingdom. She had eaten dinner with her hands at a table filled with powerful wolves who could crush her without thinking. She wasn't going to let some petty act of vandalism break her. Lyra knelt down and examined the destruction more carefully. Caught in the zipper of one of the ruined coats was something small and silver. She pulled it free and held it up to the light. A charm, shaped like a serpent, delicate and distinctive. She recognized it immediately. She had seen it yesterday dangling from a bracelet on the wrist of a sour-faced woman who had sneered at her in the hallway. One of Seraphine's attendants, a maid named Isolde. Lyra closed her fist around the charm, feeling its edges bite into her palm. She didn't call for guards, didn't run to KL crying about the injustice. Instead, she pulled on the simplest clothes she could find, a pair of oversized sweatpants and a hoodie that she was pretty sure belonged to Kale, and marched out of the room with singular purpose. She navigated the corridors with the kind of confidence she didn't really feel following the scent of expensive perfume and Southern Pack territory markers until she found the guest wing where the delegation was housed. Isolde was in the linen closet gossiping with another servant in hushed tones. When she saw Lyra approaching, her eyes widened with mock surprise, but the smirk on her lips gave her away. "Can I help you, my lady?" Isolde asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Did you get lost on your way to the scullery?" Lyra didn't answer. She stepped into the closet and kicked the door shut behind her. The sound echoed like a thunderclap in the small space. She held up the silver serpent charm. "You dropped this," Lyra said, her voice deadly calm, "while you were destroying my property." Isolde's smirk faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Lyra stepped closer, and for the first time in her life, she let the rage she had been swallowing for years rise to the surface. She channeled every ounce of Kale's energy, every bit of the strength she had absorbed from watching him command armies with nothing but his presence. "You think because I was a servant, I'm weak?" Lyra said, her voice low and hard. "But you forget something important. Servants see everything. We know every secret, every weakness, every petty cruelty that happens behind closed doors." She moved closer, backing Isolde against the shelves of linens. "I know which laundry soap causes rashes. I know which tea leaves cause stomach cramps. I know how to make someone's life miserable without ever raising my voice or leaving a trace." Yeah, Lyra leaned in, her eyes hard as flint. "And I know exactly what King Thornwell does to people who threaten his mate. So this is your one warning, Isolde. If you ever touch my things again, I won't tell the king. I will deal with you myself." She dropped the charm into the trembling woman's hand. "And I promise you, I am much more creative than he is." Lyra turned and walked out, leaving Isolde pale and shaking among the pristine white linens. Her hands were trembling as she leaned against the wall in the hallway, adrenaline crashing through her system. But beneath the fear and the shock at her own boldness, there was something else. Pride. She had stood up for herself, had bitten back, had proven that she wasn't just a victim waiting to be saved, and it felt powerful. That afternoon, while Lyra was trying to salvage what little remained of her wardrobe, a knock came at the door. It was Draven Kyle's Beta. He looked more serious than usual, his jaw tight with tension, his eyes scanning the hallway before he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Luna," he said, declining her offer of water, "I need to speak with you, and I need you to promise not to tell the king that we had this conversation." Lyra felt ice settle in her stomach. "What is it? Draven, is Kale okay?" "The king is strong," Draven said carefully, "but his position is complicated." He moved to stand by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in a military stance that suggested this conversation was painful for him. "The Iron Kingdom has always been ruled by strength," Draven continued. "The pack respects power above all else. When King Thornwell brought you here, he broke centuries of tradition. Usually a king mates with a high-ranking female from another powerful pack. It secures alliances, strengthens the bloodline." He looked at her apologetically, and Lyra felt the familiar shame trying to creep back in. "Your status or lack thereof is being used against him," Draven said bluntly. "There is a faction within our own pack, the Ironwood Loyalists. They believe the king has gone soft. They're spreading rumors that your blood is too weak to produce an heir, that any child you have will be a runt unable to lead." He paused, his expression grim. "They're using this to gather support for a challenge. A duel to the death for the crown." The room spun. Lyra sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "Does he know?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He knows," Draven nodded, "but he doesn't care. He would burn the kingdom to the ground before he lets you go. That is why I'm telling you this. You need to understand the danger he's in. He's blinded by the mate bond. He won't see the knife coming until it's buried in his back." Draven moved toward the door, then stopped. "I'm loyal to him, Luna. I have been since we were children. But I'm also loyal to this kingdom, and right now those two loyalties are at war with each other." He left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Lyra alone with a truth that threatened to shatter everything. She looked around the luxurious room that had become her cage, looked at the destroyed wardrobe, at the silk sheets, at the view of mountains that were beautiful and deadly in equal measure. She loved Kyle. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had fallen in love with the monster who had claimed her, with the man who fed her burgers and laughed like he had forgotten how, and fought to protect his pack from dangers they would never see. And if staying here meant he would die, then there was only one choice left to make. The realization broke her heart, even as it steeled her resolve. She couldn't be the reason the Iron Wolf fell. The storm that hit that night was apocalyptic. Wind howled around the stone walls of the palace, carrying snow that came down in sheets so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature had dropped to levels that would kill an unprepared shifter in minutes. It was the perfect cover. Kale was occupied in the war room dealing with the very insurrection Draven had warned about. He had kissed Lyra goodbye hours ago, promising to return before midnight. His lips had lingered on her forehead, and she had memorized the feeling, knowing it might be the last time, because she wouldn't be here when he got back. Lyra's hands shook as she packed a small duffel bag with the warmest clothes she could find, most of them stolen from Kyle's closet because her own things were destroyed. She moved mechanically, her mind carefully blank, because if she let herself think about what she was doing, she would lose her nerve. She wrote a letter. The words came out, tear-stained and brief but honest. "I'm not leaving because I don't love you. I'm leaving because I love you too much to let you destroy yourself for me. You deserve a mate who makes you stronger, not one who brings knives to your back. Please forgive me. Please forget me. Please survive. Yours, Lyra." She left it on his pillow, the white paper stark against the black silk sheets. Then she moved. The palace was a labyrinth, but Lyra had always been good at being invisible, at slipping through spaces unnoticed. She used the servant passages she had discovered during her brief kitchen adventure, avoiding the main corridors where guards would be stationed. Her heart hammered against her ribs with every step. Part of her wanted to be caught, wanted someone to stop her before she made it outside. But the rational part, the part that had learned to survive by accepting hard truths, knew this was the only way. She made it to the side exit near the stables. The door was heavy, reinforced against the brutal cold, and it took all her strength to push it open against the wind. The blizzard hit her like a physical wall. The cold was instantaneous and brutal, biting through her layers and finding skin with vicious efficiency. Snow stung her face, driven horizontal by wind that threatened to knock her off her feet. She could barely see, could barely breathe. But she pushed forward, trudging through snow that was already knee-deep, heading toward the perimeter gate. She had no plan beyond getting across the border, away from his territory, far enough that the bond would weaken and he could focus on saving his crown instead of saving her. She reached the iron gates, her fingers numb, as she fumbled with the keypad. She had seen Draven punch in the code once, had memorized it out of habit, out of the servant's instinct to notice things that might be useful later. The light turned green. The lock clicked. She pushed the gate open, sobbing into the wind, and stepped out into the freedom of the frozen wasteland beyond. Going somewhere. The voice didn't come from behind her, it came from the darkness ahead. Lyra screamed, stumbling backward as a massive shape detached itself from the shadows of the pine trees bordering the road. It was Kyle. He stood in the blizzard wearing nothing but his suit trousers and a white shirt that was soaked through with snow and sweat clinging to his muscular frame. He had no coat, no protection against the elements that would kill a normal person in minutes. But he wasn't normal. He was Alpha. And he was burning with a fury that made the storm seem gentle by comparison. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a monster. His eyes were glowing so brightly they illuminated the snow around him, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. He had felt her intent to leave through the bond, had hunted her down before she could escape. "Kale, please," Lyra cried, backing away as he stalked toward her. "I'm doing this for you. You'll lose everything if I stay. You think I care about a crown?" He roared it, his voice louder than the storm, loud enough to shake snow from the branches of nearby trees. He closed the distance in a blur of motion, grabbing her arms and hauling her against his wet, freezing chest. He wasn't gentle. He shook her, his fingers digging into her coat hard enough to bruise. "You think I care about the throne? About the council? About any of it?" He looked down at her and she saw tears mixing with the melted snow on his face. "You are my everything, Lyra. If you leave, I don't have a kingdom. I have nothing." "But they'll kill you," she sobbed, hitting his chest with numb fist. "I'm weak. I'm nothing. You deserve. You are my mate." The words were torn from somewhere deep in his soul, cracking with heartbreak and desperation. He scooped her up into his arms, crushing her against him, as if trying to merge their bodies into one being. "We go back now," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "And if you ever try to run from me again, I will chain you to my bed until you understand that you belong to me. Do you hear me? You belong to me." He turned and marched back toward the palace, carrying her through the storm. His body radiated a terrifying heat that kept the cold at bay, but she could feel him trembling. Not from the temperature, from fear, from the thought of losing her. Lyra buried her face in his neck and cried her tears hot against his frozen skin. She had tried to save him and had only succeeded in breaking his heart. But as they crossed back through the gates, back into the warmth and safety of his territory, she realized something. He had chosen her over everything else. And maybe, just maybe, that made her worth something after all. 3 days after the storm, the fever started. At first, Lyra thought it was a delayed reaction to her exposure in the blizzard. Her skin felt too tight, her senses dialed up to painful levels. The smell of coffee in the morning made her nauseous. The sound of servants whispering in the hallway was too loud, scraping against her nerves. She felt restless, unable to sit still, pacing the length of the suite like a caged animal. Her body ached with a deep, throbbing heat that pooled low in her belly and spread outward in waves. She curled up on the window seat, pressing her forehead against the cold glass, trying to find relief that wouldn't come. When Kael returned from the training grounds that afternoon, everything changed. He opened the door and froze on the threshold. His nostrils flared, his pupils blowing wide until his eyes were swallowed by darkness. The scent hit him like a physical blow, and Lyra watched as every muscle in his body went rigid with barely controlled violence. It was the scent of a mate in heat. A low, guttural growl started deep in his chest, primal and unstoppable. It was a sound that belonged to the wolf, not the man. A sound that spoke of instincts older than civilization, stronger than reason. "Kael," Lyra whispered, her voice husky and rough. "I think I'm sick." "You are not sick," he rumbled, his voice strained nearly to breaking. He slammed the door shut and locked it with a force that rattled the frame. Then he didn't move toward her. He stood there, fighting a visibly painful battle for control, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. "You are in heat, Lyra. The bond is demanding completion." He turned to the intercom system on the wall and punched the button with enough force to crack the plastic. "Draven," he barked, his voice barely human, "initiate Red Wing protocol. Clear the entire East Wing. No male personnel within 500 yards of the Master Suite. If anyone crosses this perimeter, I will kill them. Do you understand?" "Understood, Alpha." Draven's voice crackled back, urgent and knowing. Kael ripped the intercom unit off the wall and threw it into the corner, severing the connection completely. He couldn't have distractions. The scent was driving him insane, stripping away every layer of humanity he had carefully constructed. He turned to Lyra, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes. Man versus beast. Control versus instinct. I have to lock us in, he told her, his voice rough as gravel, because right now every unmated male in this pack can smell you. And if they come near this door, I will tear them apart. He walked toward her, each step deliberate, his hands already working to remove his tie. And I don't want to share. The heat in Lyra's body flared in response to his proximity. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked toward him instead of away. Then don't share, she said softly. The restraint in Kale snapped like a frayed rope. Hours later, or maybe days' time, had lost all meaning. They lay tangled in sheets that smelled of them both. The heat had crested, leaving them exhausted but euphoric, existing in a bubble of intimacy that felt sacred. Kale lay propped up on one elbow, tracing the line of her jaw with reverent fingers. He looked younger, the weight of leadership temporarily lifted. I have something for you, he murmured. He reached for the bedside table and retrieved a crystal decanter along with 2 heavy goblets. The glass caught the firelight, refracting it into rainbows across the ceiling. It's tradition in the Iron Kingdom, Kale explained, pouring deep red liquid that smelled of dark berries and oak. Before the Alpha bites his Luna, they share wine from the hidden cellar, a vintage older than the palace itself. It symbolizes the mixing of bloodlines, the joining of 2 souls. He handed her a goblet, his eyes shining with emotion she had never seen before. Vulnerability, hope, love. To us, Lyra, he said, his voice thick. To the future. She smiled, her heart so full it hurt. To us. She clinked her glass against his and took a long sip. The wine was rich and velvety, warming her chest as it went down. She set the glass on the nightstand and leaned back into the pillows, pulling Kale down for a kiss. His lips were warm, his taste addictive. He moved to hover over her, his mouth trailing down her neck to the sensitive spot where her shoulder met her throat. The marking spot. Lyra arched into him, baring her neck, ready to accept him fully. Ready to complete the bond that had been building since that first whispered word in the VIP lounge. His teeth grazed her skin, sharp and promising. And then the pain hit. It wasn't the expected bite, it was something else. Something wrong. A sharp, tearing agony exploded in her stomach, radiating outward from her gut like shards of glass. It was cold and jagged, the opposite of the heat that had been coursing through her moments before. Lyra gasped, her body arching violently off the mattress. Not in pleasure, in shock. Kale, she choked out, her hands clutching at his shoulders. Something's wrong. It hurts. Kale pulled back instantly, confusion flashing across his face. Lyra, another spasm hit her, stronger this time. Her muscles seized her vision, blurring at the edges. She coughed and blood spattered across the pristine white pillowcase. The color drained from Kale's face. He grabbed her, his hands frantically checking her temperature, her pulse searching for the source of the pain. Then he caught it beneath the scent of sex and wine and their mingled essences. There was something else. Sharp, acrid, wrong. Wolfsbane. Concentrated lethal wolfsbane mixed with something darker. Nightshade. No. He whispered the word, broken and terrified. No, no, no. He pulled her against his chest as her body began to convulse, as her skin turned a terrifying shade of gray as her eyes rolled back in her head. Help! He bellowed, a roar so loud it cracked the windows. Healers, get the healers in here now! His hands were shaking as he tried to use his own alpha energy to stabilize her, to force his strength into her failing body. But he could feel her slipping away, could feel the bond fraying at the edges. Lyra's vision was narrowing, darkness creeping in from all sides. The last thing she saw was Kale's face, twisted in absolute terror, tear streaming down his cheeks as he desperately tried to keep her heart beating. She tried to say his name, tried to tell him she loved him, tried to say goodbye, but the darkness was too strong, too hungry. It rushed in from the edges, cold and final, swallowing the room, the warmth, the man who had claimed her as his. Everything went black, and Lyra Ashenmere stopped breathing. The master suite had been transformed from a sanctuary into a war zone. Healers in white robes swarmed around the massive bed, their hands glowing with energy as they worked frantically to stabilize the dying woman at its center. The air crackled with magic and desperation, filled with shouted orders and the acrid smell of medicinal herbs being burned in brass censers. Lyra lay motionless on blood-stained sheets, her skin gray as ash, her chest barely rising. Tubes ran from her arms to glass vials suspended on metal stands. Her lips had turned blue, and despite the roaring fire in the hearth, she was cold to the touch. Kale Thornwold stood in the corner, exiled from his own bed by the head healer, who had physically shoved the Alpha King aside in order to save his mate. A brave woman, or perhaps simply desperate enough not to care about the consequences. Kale was shirtless, his chest heaving with each ragged breath, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had gone white. His eyes glowed solid gold, demonic and unblinking, fixed on Lyra's face with the kind of intensity that made the younger healers flinch when they accidentally crossed his line of sight. He wasn't grieving yet. Grief would come later if she died. Right now, he was something far more dangerous. He was hunting. In his hand, he held the crystal goblet she had drunk from the glass, cracked from the pressure of his grip. He brought it to his nose again, inhaling deeply, analyzing the scent with the precision of a predator who had spent a lifetime identifying threats. Beneath the rich aroma of aged wine, there it was, faint but unmistakable. Liquid nightshade mixed with wolfsbane, the kind of poison that killed slowly, painfully, shutting down organs one by one until there was nothing left but an empty shell. It wasn't in the bottle, Kale said, his voice eerily calm. He spoke to Draven, who stood by the door looking pale and shaken. It was in the glass. Someone dusted the inside of the glass before it was brought up here. He didn't wait for a response. Kale set the goblet down with controlled precision and walked out of the room, leaving the healers to fight for Lyra's life, while he went to find the person responsible. He was going to kill something, someone, and the only question was whether they would die quickly or slowly. The corridor outside was lined with guards, all standing at rigid attention, all trying very hard not to look directly at their king. They could feel the violence radiating from him in waves, could smell the rage that was barely leashed beneath his skin. Kale moved through the palace like a wraith, silent and swift despite his size. Draven and a squad of elite guards struggled to keep up with his long, furious strides. He kicked open the kitchen doors with enough force to splinter the wood. The staff screamed and scattered like startled birds cowering under tables and behind counters. Pots clattered to the floor. Someone dropped a tray of glasses that shattered across the tile. Kale grabbed the head steward by the collar, lifting the older man off his feet as easily as picking up a child. The steward's face turned purple, his legs dangling uselessly in the air. "Who prepared the tray?" Kale snarled, spit flying from his lips. "Who touched the glasses?" I don't know, Your Majesty," the steward stammered, weeping openly. "Please, I don't think." The word was a roar that made every piece of china in the kitchen rattle. It was Isolde," the steward gasped out. "The guest maid from the southern delegation. She said she wanted to help, said it was a peace offering from her mistress, Lady Silvercrest." Kale dropped the man who collapsed to the floor in a heap. Peace offering from Seraphine. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was assassination planned and executed by someone who thought she could kill the Luna and take her plagiar. Kale turned and walked out of the kitchen, his face carved from stone, his eyes burning with cold fire. His sights were set on the guest wing. Behind him, Draven spoke quietly to the guards. "Lock down the palace. No one from the southern delegation leaves. If they try, break their legs." The march through the corridors was a procession of barely contained violence. Servants pressed themselves against walls as Kale passed, some of them crying, all of them terrified. They had never seen their king like this. Even in war, even in the worst battles, he had maintained some semblance of control. But the mate bond was driving him to madness. He could feel Lyra dying through their connection, could feel the thread that tied them together fraying with each passing second, and the need to protect her, to avenge her, to destroy anyone who had dared to hurt what belonged to him, was overwhelming every rational thought. When he reached the doors of the southern delegation suite, the guards stationed there made the mistake of trying to step forward. Kale didn't even slow down. He backhanded the first guard with enough force to send the man flying through the drywall, his body leaving an imprint in the plaster. The second guard reached for his weapon, and Kale grabbed his arm, twisting until bones snapped with sounds like dry kindling. Then he kicked the double doors open. The suite beyond was decorated in the colors of the southern pack, crimson and gold, expensive and ostentatious. Seraphine Silvercrest sat by the fireplace, a cup of tea balanced delicately on her knee, looking the picture of refined innocence. She looked up as Kale entered, her blue eyes widening with perfectly performed surprise. "Cassius," she started, standing gracefully. "I heard there was a commotion. Is everything—" Kale crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her by the throat. She didn't get to finish the sentence. He slammed her against the stone mantelpiece hard enough to crack the marble, his hand tightening around her windpipe with brutal efficiency. Her teacup shattered on the floor, the sound distant and unimportant. "You poisoned her," Kale whispered. Despite the chaos, despite the violence, his voice was deadly calm, the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes and massacres. the kind of calm that made people's blood run cold. Seraphine clawed at his hand, gasping for air, her feet dangling off the floor. Her carefully constructed mask of composure was cracking terror, bleeding through the cracks. "You thought you could kill my mate," Kale continued, his voice still that terrible whisper, "and take her place. You thought I wouldn't know, wouldn't smell your stench on her dying breath." He tightened his grip, listening to the strain of her windpipe, watching her face turn purple. She is weak," Seraphine choked out, her voice barely audible. "She is ruining you, making you soft. I did this for she is my life." Kale's voice cracked on the last word, raw with emotion he could no longer contain. He pulled her closer until their faces were inches apart, until she could see the tears mixing with the rage in his eyes. "And you are going to pray to every deity you know that she wakes up. Because if she dies, Seraphine, I will not kill you quickly. I will not make it clean. I will spend the next 50 years peeling the skin from your bones, keeping you alive through every second of it, making sure you understand the depth of the mistake you made." He threw her to the floor like discarded trash. She curled up, coughing violently, gasping for air, her hands trembling as they went to her bruised throat. Kale looked down at her with disgust. "Guard her," he commanded the men who had filed into the room behind him. "If she moves, break her legs. No one leaves this suite. No one speaks to her. She stays here until the Luna opens her eyes." He paused at the doorway, looking back at the broken woman on the floor. "And if Lyra doesn't wake up, bring her to me. I want to be the one who ends her." Lyra was floating in an ocean of darkness. It was cold here, silent, peaceful in the way that only complete absence could be. There was no pain in this place, no fear, no shame, just the gentle pull of something deeper, something that promised rest after a lifetime of struggle. She was sinking slowly, inevitably into the abyss, and it would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting, to sleep forever in this quiet nothingness. But then a sound pierced the darkness, a howl. Not Kael's roar, something higher, sharper, a sound of pure defiance that echoed through the void like a battle cry. "Wake up!" The voice wasn't external. It came from inside her, commanding and ancient, carrying the weight of something she had never known existed within her own soul. Lyra looked around the void, her consciousness forming itself into something that resembled her physical body. "Who's there?" "We are." A shape materialized from the shadows, and Lyra's breath caught if she could breathe in this place. It was a wolf, massive and beautiful and terrifying. Its fur was pure white, gleaming with an inner light that pushed back the darkness. Its eyes were molten silver, ancient and knowing, burning, with a power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "You," Lyra whispered, recognition flooding through her. "You're my wolf, the part of me I thought I never had." The white wolf moved closer, its presence overwhelming. "We have always been here, dormant, waiting. Your lineage was suppressed, hidden by your parents to protect you from those who would hunt us. But we are of the spirit wolf bloodline, ancient, sovereign, born from the first shifters who walked this earth." "The poison, Ba," Lyra said, understanding beginning to dawn. "It was supposed to kill me." "The poison didn't kill us," the wolf growled, nudging Lyra's spectral form with its wet nose. "It woke us up. They tried to end your life, and instead they gave us the catalyst we needed to break through the barriers that held us down." The wolf's silver eyes glowed brighter. "We are of the iron bloodline, now bound to the iron wolf himself. We do not die in bed. We do not surrender to poison. We fight." Lyra felt something shift inside her, a power she had never known she possessed rising up from depths she hadn't known existed. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "What do I do?" she asked. "You choose," the wolf said simply. "You can stay here where it's safe, where no one can hurt you. Or you can fight. You can go back to the world of pain and struggle and prove to everyone who ever doubted you that they were wrong." The wolf leaned closer, its breath hot against Lyra's face. "You can show them that you are not weak, not broken, not nothing. You can show them that you are a queen." Lyra looked at the beautiful, powerful creature that was part of her, had always been part of her, just waiting for the moment when she would be ready to accept it. She thought of Kale, of the way he had looked at her in the VIP lounge, like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked, of the way he had fed her burgers and laughed and fought to protect her from a world that wanted to destroy them both. She thought of the promise she had made to herself when she confronted Isolde in that linen closet, that she would stop being a victim, that she would fight back. "I choose to go back," Lyra said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "I choose to fight." The white wolf smiled, baring teeth that could tear through steel. "Good, then we fight together." It lunged forward and bit down on Lyra's spectral hand. The pain was electric, sharp and bright, shooting through her entire being like lightning. The darkness shattered like glass. Reality came rushing back in a flood of sensation, pain, and cold, and the smell of herbs, and the sound of people shouting, and the overwhelming presence of something heavy on her legs. Lyra gasped, her eyes snapping open, her body arching off the mattress as every nerve reconnected and screamed to life. The room spun into focus, healers jumping back in shock. White robes and brass censers and the orange glow of firelight. And there, kneeling beside the bed with his head resting on her stomach, his hand gripping hers so tightly her fingers had gone numb, was Kyle. He looked destroyed. Red-rimmed eyes, tear-stained face, stubble covering his jaw. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, had spent every second since she collapsed, locked in this room, refusing to leave her side even when the healers insisted. Kale! Lyra rasped her throat, feeling like sandpaper. His head snapped up so fast she heard his neck crack. For a moment he just stared at her, his expression caught between disbelief and desperate hope, like he was seeing a ghost, like he was afraid to believe she was real. Then a sob broke from his chest, shattering the stoic mask he had worn for so long. Lyra, he breathed, scrambling up to cup her face in his hands. You came back. You came back to me. I saw her. Lyra whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. My wolf, she showed me who I really am. Kale's eyes widened. He was staring at her face with an expression of awe and shock. Your eyes, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Lyra, your eyes. She didn't need a mirror to know what he was seeing. She could feel it. The power humming through her veins, changing her on a fundamental level. Her eyes were no longer brown. They were molten silver, glowing with inner light, the mark of the spirit wolf bloodline. The head healer gasped, dropping to one knee. A spirit wolf, the legends were true. Lyra sat up and the monitors attached to her arm began beeping frantically as her vital signs stabilized into something far stronger than they had been before. She felt different. The weakness that had plagued her all her life was gone, burned away by the awakening of her true nature. She looked at Kale and the bond between them sang with renewed strength. Where is she? Lyra asked, her voice cold and hard in a way it had never been before. Where is the woman who tried to kill me? Kale's expression darkened, the grief shifting back to the promise of violence. She is waiting for judgment, he said. Lyra swung her legs over the side of the bed, pushing away the healer who tried to stop her. She stood up, swaying only slightly, and Kyle was there immediately to steady her. She looked up at him, the silver in her eyes swirling like liquid metal. Good, she said. Take me to her. I want her to see that she missed. The great hall of the Iron Palace was a vast cavern of stone and shadow lit by torches that cast dancing light across faces carved with anticipation and fear. The entire pack had been summoned. 500 wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, filling every available space, their collective breath creating clouds of steam in the cold air. They were silent, waiting, their eyes fixed on the center of the room where judgment would be passed. In the middle of the floor, Seraphine Silvercrest knelt on the cold stone. Her expensive red dress was torn and dirty, her silver blonde hair matted and tangled. Her hands were bound with silver chains that burned her skin, leaving angry red welts on her wrists. She looked small, pathetic. Nothing like the arrogant woman who had sneered at Lyra on the tarmac. Beside her stood Kale Thornweld, a dark sentinel of judgment. His hand rested on the hilt of a massive broadsword, the blade etched with runes that had tasted the blood of traitors before. He was waiting. They were all waiting. For her. The double doors at the far end of the hall groaned open. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a sound like wind through trees. Lyra walked in. She was pale from blood loss, leaning slightly on Draven for support, her steps careful but determined. She wore simple clothes, Kael's black shirt hanging to her knees over dark leggings. It was a deliberate choice. No finery, no pretense, just raw, honest reality. But it was her eyes that silenced the room completely. They swirled with luminous metallic silver. The mark of the spirit wolf, a bloodline that hadn't been seen in the Northern Territories for 300 years. A bloodline that existed only in legends whispered by grandmothers to wide-eyed children. The pack didn't see a weak Omega servant anymore. They saw a miracle. They saw their queen. Lyra walked slowly to the center of the room, each step measured and deliberate. The pain from the poison was still there, a dull ache in her bones, but she refused to show it. Refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her weak. She stopped a few feet from Seraphine. The kneeling woman looked up, and when she saw Lyra's silver eyes, she recoiled as if struck. Horror and disbelief warred on her face. You, Seraphine whispered, her voice cracking. What are you? Lyra looked down at her, and there was no pity in her expression. Only cold assessment. I am the mistake you made, she said simply. Kael drew the broadsword. The sound of steel against leather was sharp and final, echoing through the silent hall. He held the hilt out to Lyra, offering her the weapon with both hands. She is yours to judge, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. The punishment for treason and attempted regicide is death. Take her head, and the pack will know your strength. Lyra looked at the heavy sword, then at the trembling woman at her feet. She saw the fear in Seraphine's eyes, the same fear that Lyra had lived with her entire life. The fear of being nothing, of having no value, of being discarded by a world that had no use for the weak. Killing her would be easy. It would satisfy the rage burning in Lyra's chest, would prove to everyone watching that she was strong enough to rule beside Kael. But it would also make her exactly like the people who had made her life hell. And Lyra realized, standing there with the weight of hundreds of eyes on her back, that she didn't want to rule through fear. She wanted to rule through something stronger. She pushed the sword away. The pack murmured, confusion rippling through the crowd. No, Lyra said clearly. Kael frowned. Lyra, she tried to kill you. She deserves. Death is too easy. Lyra interrupted, her voice ringing with authority she hadn't known she possessed. She stepped closer to Seraphine, leaning down until they were eye to eye. If I kill you, your pain ends in a second. You become a martyr. Your father uses your death to justify war, and the cycle continues. Lyra straightened, addressing the entire hall now. I want her to live. Strip her of her titles. Strip her of her rank. Break the treaty with her father's pack, and banish her to the rogue lands. Seraphine screamed. It was a sound of pure animalistic terror. Oh, kill me! Please just kill me. To a highborn wolf, becoming a rogue was a fate infinitely worse than death. It meant being packless, homeless, hunted by every territory she tried to enter. It meant slow degradation, fighting for scraps, losing her humanity piece by piece until there was nothing left but the beast. Lyra looked down at her without sympathy. You wanted to treat me like trash, she said quietly. Now you'll see what it feels like to be nothing. She turned to Kael. Get her out of my sight. Kael stared at his mate with an expression that mixed shock, awe, and fierce pride. He had offered her a sword, and she had chosen something far more devastating than steel. He sheathed the broadsword with a sharp snap, then turned to the pack. He raised his hand and let out a roar that shook dust from the rafters. It was a sound of victory, of acceptance of a king claiming his queen before his people. The pack roared back. The sound was deafening, shaking the very foundations of the palace. They weren't cheering for an execution. They were cheering for mercy that had been stronger than vengeance. They were cheering for a queen who had proven that true strength wasn't about how many enemies you killed, but about knowing when to show power through restraint. Guards dragged the screaming Seraphine away, and the hall erupted in celebration. Lyra stood at the center of it all, silver eyes blazing, and felt the weight of her new reality settle onto her shoulders. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was their queen. The master suite was quiet after the chaos of the great hall. Kael carried Lyra inside and locked the door behind them, sealing out the world in its celebrations. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the judgment was fading now, leaving her trembling with exhaustion. He didn't take her to the bed. Instead, he settled into the large armchair by the fire, pulling her into his lap and holding her like she might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly. For a long moment, they just breathed together. His face was buried in her hair, and she could feel him shaking. You terrified me, Kael murmured against her neck, his voice thick with emotion. When I saw you on that bed, when I couldn't feel the bond anymore, I thought my world had ended. I thought I had lost you. I'm here, Lyra whispered, resting her head against his shoulder. She could hear his heart pounding, feel the residual fear still coursing through him. My wolf wouldn't let me go. She said we don't die in bed. She is strong, Kael agreed, pulling back just enough to look into her silver eyes. Stronger than I ever gave you credit for. You offered mercy to someone who tried to murder you. You chose a fate crueler than death without lifting a weapon. You are dangerous, my love. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, his touch reverent. But we are not finished, he said quietly. The bond, it's frayed from the poison. The connection is weak, unstable. We need to seal it permanently or it will continue to deteriorate. Lyra knew what he meant. The marking, the final step that would bind their souls and bodies together, allowing them to share strength, thoughts, and pain. Before the poisoning, she had been ready. Now, after staring death in the face and coming back stronger, she wanted nothing more than to be tethered to him forever. She shifted in his lap, straddling his waist, her hands moving to his shoulders. Then do it, she commanded softly. Claim me, Kyle. Make sure I can never leave you again. Kale groaned a sound that was half pleasure and half pain. His hands came up to cup her face, tilting her head back to expose the vulnerable curve of her neck, where her pulse beat strong and steady. This will hurt, he warned, his voice rough, but only for a moment. I know, Lyra said. I trust you. He leaned in, kissing the spot first, a tender, reverent touch that made her shiver. His lips traced the line from her jaw to her shoulder, mapping the territory he was about to claim. Then his canines elongated sharp and white in the firelight. With a sudden surge of possessive intensity, he bit down. The pain was white-hot, and immediate sharp teeth piercing skin and muscle, and finding the nerve cluster beneath. Lyra gasped, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her body going rigid. But the pain was immediately followed by something else. Euphoria. It flooded her system like liquid fire, overwhelming every sense. She could feel Kale's emotions crashing into her mind through the bond, his overwhelming love, his possessive need, his bone-deep relief that she was alive and whole in his. The connection between them flared bright and strong, no longer frayed, but reinforced, binding them together in a way that went beyond physical. Their souls knitted together, fusing into something that was both separate and unified. Lyra's silver eyes flared brighter, mixing with the gold of Kale's in a psychic dance that lit up the room. He held the bite for several heartbeats, making sure the mark was deep and permanent. Then he released, licking the wound to seal it with his saliva, which would help it heal into a scar that would mark her as his for the rest of her life. When he pulled back to look at her, his eyes were wet. Mine, he growled, and the word echoed not just in the room but inside her head, resonating through the bond they now shared completely. Yours. Lyra replied, feeling the truth of it settle deep in her bones. Always yours. She leaned down and kissed him, tasting blood and salt, and the future they would build together. The invisible girl was gone forever. In her place was a queen. 1 month later, the Iron Palace had transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Black and gold banners hung from every surface, snapping in the winter wind. The scent of roasting meat and spiced wine filled the air. Thousands of candles had been lit throughout the fortress, turning the usually stark stone corridors into rivers of warm light. It was the night of the coronation ball, the official presentation of the Luna to the allied packs. Every alpha of significance from the northern territories had been invited, along with delegations from the east and west. Even some of the southern packs had sent representatives carefully neutral after the scandal with Seraphine. Lyra stood in front of a full-length mirror in the master suite, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The dress was liquid gold silk, custom-made by artisans who had worked day and night to create something worthy of a spirit wolf queen. It hugged her curves she had gained now that she was eating regularly and no longer wasting away from stress and malnourishment, and flowed down to pool at her feet like molten metal. The dress was backless, designed specifically to display the crescent-shaped scar on her neck, the mark of her mate. It wasn't hidden or covered with makeup. It was proudly displayed, a symbol of the bond that had shaken the foundations of pack politics. Her hair had been styled in cascading waves adorned with the small crystals that caught the light, but it was her eyes that drew the attention. They still held that silver shimmer, though it had settled into something more subtle, visible only when the light hit them at certain angles. She looked regal, powerful, like a queen. But underneath all the finery, she was still just Lyra, and the butterflies in her stomach reminded her of that fact. You look like a goddess. The voice came from behind her. Kale had entered the room, and he stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. He was breathtaking in his formal alpha regalia. Black military dress uniform with gold medals across his chest, each one representing a battle won or a territory defended. His dark hair was styled back from his face, emphasizing the sharp lines of his jaw and the intensity of his golden eyes. But despite all the formal trappings, there was something soft in his expression when he looked at her. Something vulnerable. I look like a queen, Lyra corrected, turning to face him with a smile. Better, Kale agreed, crossing the room to stand before her. He offered his arm, the gesture formal and courtly. Are you ready? Lyra took a deep breath, placed her hand on his arm, and nodded. Ready. They walked out of the suite and down the grand staircase. As they appeared at the top of the stairs, the music in the ballroom below stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Thousands of faces turned upward. For a heartbeat, Lyra felt the old fear try to claw its way back. All those eyes, all that judgment, all those people who could see every flaw and weakness she had tried so hard to hide. But then she felt Kale's arm solid beneath her hand, felt the bond between them, humming with strength and support, and remembered who she was now. She was the spirit wolf Luna. She had survived poison. She had shown mercy when others would have chosen violence. She had earned her place here, as one the entire room bowed. It wasn't the polite, perfunctory bow of political necessity. It was deep and reverent, a true acknowledgement of her position and power. Pack members dropped to one knee, their heads bowed in submission and respect. Lyra and Kale descended the stairs together, not as king and servant, but as equals, partners, mates. They moved to the center of the dance floor and the crowd parted to give them space. The orchestra began to play a slow, haunting waltz that had been composed specifically for this occasion. Kyle pulled her close, his hand firm on her waist, and they began to dance. The world blurred around them as they spun. Lyra looked up at her mate and remembered the first time she had seen him sleeping on that couch in the VIP lounge. She had been so terrified then, so certain that she was nothing and would always be nothing. Now she held the monster in her arms, and he was the safest place in the world. "They are all looking at you," Kale whispered in her ear. Lyra smiled, echoing the words he had said to her weeks ago. "Let them look. I'm not invisible anymore." The song ended, but they didn't separate. Kale kept her close, his eyes locked on hers. Then he turned to address the room, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "Hear me all, packs of the Northern Territories," he said, his tone formal and commanding. "This woman is my mate, my Luna, my queen. She has proven her worth through strength and mercy. She carries the bloodline of the spirit wolves, ancient and sovereign, and I claim her before all of you, now and forever." He took her hand and raised it above their heads. "She is mine," he declared, "and I am hers." The crowd erupted, not in polite applause, but in roars and howls that shook the chandeliers. The sound of acceptance, of celebration, of a pack recognizing their queen. Lyra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She turned to Kyle and placed her hand over his heart. "And he is mine," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Forever." Kyle leaned down and kissed her right there in front of everyone. It was passionate and claiming and completely improper for a formal event. The crowd went wild, and Lyra Ashenmere, who had once been invisible, who had once been nothing, kissed her mate back and felt complete. 1 year later, the nursery was the warmest room in the entire palace, painted in soft creams and filled with the scent of baby powder and lavender. Outside, winter snow was falling gently, blanketing the Iron Kingdom in silence. But inside there was life. The kingdom had flourished under the dual rule of the Iron Wolf and his Spirit Wolf Queen. The borders were secure. The rebellions had ceased. New alliances had been forged with packs who recognized that strength came in many forms, not just brute force. Changes had been made. Omegas now sat on the council. Pack laws had been reformed to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. The Iron Kingdom had become a beacon of progress, proving that tradition and innovation could coexist. And through it all, Kale and Lyra had ruled together. Not as king and subject, but as partners. Lyra walked quietly into the nursery, her bare feet making no sound on the plush rug. She smiled at the sight before her. In the large rocking chair by the window, Kale was asleep. The massive, lethal alpha who made nations tremble was slumped comfortably in the chair, his mouth slightly open, looking completely exhausted. Curled up on his broad chest, rising and falling with his deep breaths, was a tiny bundle wrapped in a black blanket. Prince Rowan. He was only 3 weeks old, but he already had his father's dark hair and terrifyingly his mother's stubbornness. Kale had insisted on taking every night shift, claiming that an alpha needed little sleep. But clearly their son had won this particular battle. One of Kale's large hands rested protectively over the infant's back, dwarfing the child. The other hung loosely over the armrest, completely relaxed in a way he never was anywhere else. It was a tableau of absolute peace, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos that had brought them together. Lyra moved closer, her heart swelling with a love so vast it hurt. She reached out and gently brushed a lock of hair from Kale's forehead. He didn't wake, but he stirred his arm, tightening instinctively around the baby. He mumbled something unintelligible in his sleep, his brow furrowing as if he were fighting a dream battle. Lyra leaned down, her lips brushing against his ear. The memory of that first night in the VIP lounge washed over her. The fear, the recklessness, the single sentence that had changed the course of both their lives. Everything had come full circle. She smiled, realizing that some things were worth repeating. "You're still the most handsome devil," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, soft and trembling, just like it had been that night. Kale's eyes didn't snap open this time. There was no roar, no locked door, no desperate claiming. Instead, a slow, lazy smile spread across his face. His eyes cracked open, just a sliver, revealing a glint of molten gold. He didn't move the baby, didn't shift position, just looked at his wife with a love that could burn down the world and rebuild it better. Mine, he whispered back the word, a promise and a truth. Yours, Lyra replied. He shifted carefully, mindful of the sleeping infant on his chest, and reached out with his free hand to pull Lyra into his lap. She settled carefully beside him, and together they looked down at their son. Prince Rowan stirred, making a small noise, and both parents held their breath. But he settled back into sleep, secure in the warmth and safety of being held by the two people who loved him most. Do you ever think about that night? Lyra asked quietly. In the lounge. Every day, Cale murmured. I think about how close I came to never hearing you whisper those words. How many times I almost gave up looking for you. He kissed her temple, his lips lingering. And I think about how grateful I am that you were brave enough to speak, even when you thought no one was listening. Lyra rested her head on his shoulder, careful not to disturb the baby between them. They thought I was nothing, she said softly. They thought the devil would destroy me. They were wrong. They were very wrong, Cale agreed. Lyra looked up at him, silver eyes meeting gold. I didn't tame the beast, she said. I matched him. Cale's smile was fierce and proud. And together we became unstoppable. Outside, white wolves howled in the distance, the sound of the pack, healthy and strong and thriving. Inside, a family sat together in the warmth, safe and loved and complete. The invisible girl was gone. The lonely king had found his home. And the whisper that had started it all echoed through the years, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change everything. Lyra Ashenmere had been nobody, a servant, an omega with no value and no future. Now she was a queen, a mother, a mate. She had survived poison and politics and her own self-doubt. She had shown the world that strength came in many forms and that mercy could be more powerful than violence. And as she sat in that warm nursery with her mate and their child watching snow fall gently outside the window, she finally understood what it meant to be home.